Welcome. Welcome to a Sunday stream by yours truly, Sound Engraver. I hope you guys are all doing well. We are going to be talking a little bit about media today and really all forms of media. Whatever side or whichever side, rather, whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, whatever part, you're of the spectrum you're on, if you're in the middle, left, right, somewhere in the middle between those. And then also, whether it's independent or it's mainstream. Some of these, actually, I would carefully say that all of these media outlets that you might like do share a few things in common. They share things in common with their rivals. Even the independent outlets do share a few things with share these things in common with the mainstream guys. So hopefully everything sounds good. Of course, we've been having some rainy weather and heat, so I hope audio is clear. It looks clear to me, but I do not have my Wi-Fi on my phone, and I also do not have it up. I don't have YouTube up, so good. Good, of course, confirmed by my wonderful professor. He says I sound great. So we'll go ahead and welcome the chat, and then we'll get right to it. So we have Ace with us. We've got Glitterhoof. Welcome. I don't think I've seen you before, so welcome. And we've got Brian, our longtime friend. He says, no way I'm going to miss this one. This needs to be said. Well, I hope I say everything I need to say. And of course, we have my wonderful prof as well, calling me his shield maiden. And he is my Erendil and Baron and all the wonderful men of Middle Earth put together. Okay, so good. Audio is clear. So I think what we'll do is we'll just get right to it. And by the way, I might be missing some comments since my YouTube isn't up, and StreamYard does miss a few comments by default. So I do apologize if I don't see everyone. So we'll get right to it. Of course, grabbing a swig of water. Okay, so, I want to talk about media with all intellectual honesty and sincerity. And I don't mean to say what I say as a way of encouraging people to stop watching media. I do watch the news through different YouTube channels and podcasts. Actually, really, I listen just to one podcast. And through that podcast, I get all the news. So I will still watch the news or listen to the news in some way. I think it is important to know what's going on in the world. I think it's important to understand the seriousness of what's going on in the world. But even the independent news outlets or the independent podcasts that, talk about these different things, I think any viewer or any listener should proceed with caution. These kind of telltale, actually, they're not telltale. They're just symptoms of, I guess, these things we ought to be aware of. So let's get right to it. I'm thinking of four things that all the media outlets share, and that they all have these four things in common. So again, as repeating myself, whether it's mainstream or independent, it doesn't matter. Conservative, liberal, far left, far right, somewhere in the middle, it doesn't matter. All of these people have these four things in common. So let's start with the first thing. Actually, I'll say all of them and then I'll go in order, just trying to explain the different things. The first thing is emotion. The second thing is the addiction of the bad, or the addiction to the bad, depending on the preposition. The unimportant. I know that's a little abstract, but we'll get into that. And the colloquial. So let's talk about first the emotion, then the addiction to the bad news, or the addiction of the bad news, the unimportant things that media seems to harp on, and the colloquial. So let's start with the emotion. So one of the things, I haven't watched the news in years. I used to watch the news, the mainstream news, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when I really didn't have a lot going on. I was in between jobs and I didn't have the internet at one point, so the TV was on. I was staying at a relative's, and I decided, okay, if there's no sitcom that I like, then I'll just go switch over to the news. And it was a short stint listening to the news because even back 8 or 9 years ago, I was very much picking on the or picking up rather, I was picking up this heightened state of emotion by people who I would even agree with and whose political leanings are more aligned with my own, but the emotion was, ramped up. It was up too many notches. I think when you're talking about the news and when you're talking about especially very bad and serious situations, you really should be more level-headed, even as someone with opinions, even as a commentator. Even if you're not a journalist or a reporter and you are just providing commentary and you are just providing opinion pieces, I do think you should have that disposition that is more, "Oh, that person has a good head on their shoulders," or "That person is logical," or "That person is intellectual." Now, I'm not saying you should be devoid of emotion, but the emotion that I had seen 8 or 9 years ago, and especially now, I would say historically speaking, really the emotion has ramped up to level 11 since the presidential election of 2016. We all know this. Whatever side you are on, you do know that the emotion has gone up quite a bit since 2016. And and so, 8 or so years ago, I'm like, "Well, I don't really need this. Maybe I should go online." Actually, it was about 8 years ago when I was exploring, seeking my news and entertainment on YouTube, and I'm glad I have. Most of my, seeking different things around, the online space is YouTube. I don't go to the mainstream news and not even really the independent news or news that would be seen, going against mainstream. And the reason for that is, you I look at these commentators and I'm thinking, "You can say these things without so much hype. You can say these things without so much fervor." And the reason why I think that's important is that this emotional fervor that we do see with commentators of all kinds has actually rather induced society and also individuals like you and me. I've experienced this as an individual. The emotional fervor of a very serious situation actually induces anxiety, or it induces uncertainty. It can induce impression to different people. People who are predisposed to things like anxiety and depression, the news with its emotive state, this kind of heightened emotive state, actually induces more anxiety. Like, if you already are predisposed to something like anxiety, you will feel more anxious coming out of watching the news or listening to the news. And so I had not watched the news for a long time. Any bit of news, even if it was affiliated with a mainstream outlet, any bit of news that I listened to was through a podcast with either a few people who are intellectual, who can, reason or who can lay out their thoughts in a logical way, in a succinct way, or satire. So if there was like a comedic group of people who would laugh at a certain situation, and it was either that, it was either level-headed intellectuals or it was satire. And then when their podcasts left, their affiliation with this outlet, I'm like, I'm not going back to this major outlet. I don't need this major outlet. And so I said, "Okay, well, I guess I'll go to YouTube." And that's when I just saw independent creators talking about different things like popular culture. That's actually when I got to know wonderful people, especially someone as wonderful as Professor Geek. My journeying through YouTube actually was a response to, I don't want to go back to the mainstream stuff because of this emotion, this hyperactivity. We've all had friends or we've all known people in high school, for instance, who have a rather hyperactive disposition. And maybe someone who is really hyperactive, they're either the class clown and funny and popular, or they're very unpopular because of their hyperactive nature. And so I think people actually do respond emphatically and maybe more negatively to people who are hyperactive. And I think it's the same. I think that the same is true with this hyperactive, emotive response from these commentators on both mainstream and independent news outlets, or I should just say media outlets, because let's be real, I don't even call it the news anymore. We do get our news from different people, but it really more or less is discourse. It can be opinionated, it can be logical, it could be analytical, but it is more discourse between people and all of that. So that's the first thing, the emotion. So I actually did go, I discovered a podcast. Actually, the logo's on the thumbnail there on the top right, I believe. And I'm fine with sharing with you guys who I listen to. I am more conservative as far as my political leanings. You know, I'm religious, I'm Christian. So I listen to people who do have the side of the story that is more conservative. But I don't want to say specifically to it like a two-tiered system or a two-party system. I listen to libertarians, I listen to religious people, I listen to atheists, and a conglomeration of such a group, actually, I've come to really admire and respect is the British group called the Podcast of the Lotus Eaters, or Lotus Eaters. Now, they would not be seen favorably by certain political entities. And even though they are independent, it was founded by a man named Carl, who is a bit of a controversial figure on Twitter and YouTube, but that's just his disposition as a logical atheist with conservative traditional leanings. But I do listen to him and his group of men. You just talking intellectually, they are very much, their disposition is intellectual, their discourse is very level-headed. But I will say this, I can only listen to their videos, I wouldn't say sparingly, because I do listen to them quite frequently, but I would say that even with them, even with their level-headed nature about them, even though the environment is not as emotional as you would see with something like the mainstream, I do have to be careful with what I listen to. And this gets into the other side of the emotion, because if I listen to them too frequently, or if I listen to too many of their videos, I actually can end up being depressed. I can end up being depressed by what's going on in the world. So even if you are hearing who you believe to be a level-headed presenter, you gotta take this content in small doses, because I'm not predisposed to depression. I've never had depression before. But if I listen to very serious situations, very serious news bites on a very much a high frequency level, then I can actually that can actually induce me to a state of uncertainty and depression and anxiety if I'm not careful. So I will take a break, or if I see something on the thumbnail, if I see something on their thumbnail that I don't like or I know would depress me, I actually don't watch the video, even if it's informative, even if it's important to understand maybe what's going on in the UK, or something that might be going on here in the United States. If it's any if there's any chance, if I'm aware of any chance of that content depressing me, I won't watch it, even if it's informative. Now, people might argue and they might say, "Well, I don't want to be ignorant of the situation." The thing is, I'm not saying you should go by the saying ignorance is bliss, but there is I would say there's there can be a healthy way of living, of being informed by things that are important, but then also saying no to things that are just, repeats, or things regurgitated. And when you know there's a situation at hand, when you know the economic problems or the sociopolitical problems, when you see a rise of things or a movement of things, you don't need to know every single detail of every single thing, because it can first of all, it won't surprise you, and second of all, it could depress you even if you're not predisposed to things like chronic depression. So even with someone like the Lotus Eaters, this group of intellectual guys that I do like listening to because they're very reasonable, and they actually do talk about these things in a more lighthearted way. They have different personalities that are quite attractive to the viewer. It's not so much, there's no vitriol, with these guys. So even if you would heartily disagree with them, there's no biting vitriol. There's no, they have their opinions without being opinionated, which is really quite nice. But I have to watch these videos very carefully. And if there is something like a thumbnail or a headline or a YouTube video title that just, I would say, you know what, this, I don't need to know this. This would actually make me sad. I don't watch it. Another, and I'm fine with saying this to you guys. I know maybe future listeners would say, "Oh my gosh, she listened to him." But I actually, for a couple of months, not really knowing who this individual is, for a few months, I think it was like in the winter. It's snowy and you're kind of listening to videos more often if you're not going out or if you're not teaching or whatever. I had listened to uh, Tim Pool's podcast for a few months, and I really didn't listen to his podcast for him. I actually listened to his podcast for, knowing different guests that he had on, like whether it was a politician or someone in the military or some specialist that he was interviewing. And I would be listening more interested in what they had to say. But last month, when nothing, I used to listen to him if I was like cooking something and there was nothing else. Like I had finished all the videos of other channels that I wanted to hear for the week. And I'm like, oh, he's streaming live. He streams live every night. So, okay, nothing's on, like, as far as my YouTube cable is concerned. And so I don't want to explore YouTube. I'll just listen mindlessly to, Timcast because I kind of know what his personality is. And then it got to the point, I think it was around last month or maybe 6 weeks ago, where I just couldn't listen to him or his group anymore. I'm not saying they're a bad group of people, but even with the different guests that he had on, his headlines are very much dire warning, like almost premonition kind of. If you see his YouTube video, his podcast or whatever, or Timcast as it's called, his thumbnails are quite alarming looking. They'll have a picture of him and then he'll have a title all in all caps. And I'm not against all caps. I use all caps, but he'll put it in such a way where it's very much this is a warning, and it would be like white text, and then the main point of the text would be in red, to alarm you. It's supposed to like get you, intrigued. And this is kind of what CNN does. This is what Fox News does. So, even an independent creator, a media creator like Tim Pool, even though he's very, very popular, he's falling more in lockstep with, oh, we've got to be emotive. We've got to get people riled up. We've got to warn people. It's like that. And what's interesting is that I was listening to him one night, and I just thought, like, between him and his friends, and maybe the people he was interviewing, I'm not really sure. I was listening to their speech. I was listening to their rhetoric, and some people can listen to this and not be affected, but for me, it's like, no, I can't do it. And that is, whether he means to or not, Tim Pool actually uses language that is very similar to fear mongering. He'll use very strong language like Civil War or World War III. And the thing is, I'm not saying you shouldn't be cautious about the things of the world and maybe the trajectory of where things are going. I'm saying, yeah, be cautious, be careful. But when you use, especially with a big audience, when you use words or phrases like Civil War or Revolution or World War III, you can actually incite in the listener like this degree of angst or uncertainty. And it's like, you know what? Even if he's right, even if he would be right in his predictions with certain events, unless I see it for myself, I'm not gonna listen to it because it actually does make me grow, what would be the word? I don't wanna say sad, but it's a level of uncertainty that is not healthy. I'm not saying you shouldn't, um, have uncertainty of things, or I'm not saying things shouldn't be, outside or what am I trying to say? I'm not saying things shouldn't be familiar. I'm not saying, avoid the unknown. But when you're hearing someone with great influence use very strong language for things that may happen or things that might not happen. So if things end up not happening as people are spelling out, then the anxiety is moot. Like, your cause for anxiety and to be depressed and to be anxious over things that actually don't end up happening is like, I spent all those days worrying. I spent all those weeks worrying, and that's a sad situation. So after a few months, even if it was like a political leader I would like to know about, with Tim Cast or Tim Pool interviewing, I'm thinking, no, his language is just too strong. It's too strong for me, and he doesn't have that level-headed disposition. Well, I want to say this carefully. He does speak, things very well, but he doesn't have the level-headed good head on the shoulders disposition that people of the Lotus Eaters have. And so I actually, because his podcast was inducing kind of this uncertainty and this level of anxiety, well, that's an emotion I don't need in my life. In fact, I would say that's an emotion many people would not need in their lives. So that's what I want to say. That's what I would like to bring to the table, with the first thing that all media, independent or mainstream, left leaning, right leaning, somewhere in the middle, they all share this language that induces emotion. They all share this emotive method. I've got to scare you. I've got to make you concerned. We've got to warn you. Everyone, even if they're well-meaning, even if they have a good head on their shoulders, everyone in major media, media that would have millions of viewers or even hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, they all share this need, like, well, to get the views, to get the ratings, we have to, induce people to a worried state. We have to look more emotive. We have to sound more, emotional. We have to have this kind of emotional fervor that gets people on edge, that keeps people wanting to hear us more. So that's the first thing that all media shares. Let me grab another swig of water. And just to confirm again, I do listen to the podcast of Lotus Eaters. I think they're great guys. For the emotion for them, they're not emotional people. They're very rational people, and I like listening to the way they speak. And very intellectual, highly intellectual group of guys. Um, However, if I can't listen to every video of theirs because it would induce a kind of a depressing emotion, like, oh man, I don't. That's another of the same story, or it's a different, it's the same story with a different person or a different group of people. I don't want to look at this. So there's nothing that I have against, the independent podcasts, like Lotus Eaters, but even their content, I guess it goes into their content that can actually induce an emotional state of mind that you really don't want to be in. So the emotion is the first thing, inducing that emotional state, that psychological state is the first thing that all the media outlets share. The second is the addiction to the bad. And so none of us are surprised by this, whether it's my channel or the channels that I listen to or you listen to. We all do talk about, Professor Geek, of course, with things like DC and then Marvel and all of that. We all talk about, in one way or another, in our own independent discourse, the addiction to the bad. So we've reached in the popular culture. We'll get back to the main media outlets. But going to compare it with the popular culture, we're seeing this new trend that has really started, I would say as early as 2018 with the release of Captain Marvel, but I would say it's before that. But I guess the safe point of commencement is really the Last Jedi, of course, with the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Since then, we have had people in the YouTube industry really rake in the views and the revenue when talking about bad things. And we in the popular cultural world, it's gotten to the point now where it's no longer criticism of the bad art. It is the dogged watching of the bad art and complaining about it. It really is a psychological addiction. Fan Man, last year or sometime, Fan Man is Professor Geek and Big Al's friend. He's not doing videos now, but he had done videos in the past where he really did talk about the fan addiction or fan addict, for of course the word fanatic, where there's this kind of level of uh, this dopamine, excuse me, this level of dopamine that kicks when people are seeing a bad film and then bashing it. Seeing a bad film and providing commentary on it. And it's kind of like the car wreck scenario, where the wreckage can be on the other side of the freeway, but your side of the freeway will, through the rubberneck reaction, will stop to a grinding halt to spectate, to see the wreckage on the other side. We do have that. We are predisposed to that mentality as human beings, and we have to understand it. We have to understand this addiction and be aware of it. So with the popular culture, with things like the fandom menace, we are seeing this gratuitous amount of content on just bashing the bad. Now, I'm not against analytical criticism. I'm not against being objective when it comes to bad art. If you know my channel, I've talked about this a number of times. So I'm not against being critical when talking about it through an objective lens on what's happening in art history or what is happening with the world of popular art. But now it's gotten to the point where when people produce content only to bash bad art, you'll notice it's kind of like with the media. It's kind of like with CNN and MSNBC. They're saying the same things over and over and over. So with going back to something like the fandom menace with popular art, it's like, okay, guys, yeah, we know this is a problem. Oh, okay, you're going to say this for 40 other videos. Or, we know the problem of bad writing. We know the problem of actors and their shenanigans. We know the problem of the misalignment of characters. We know the problem of subverting expectations. We know the problem of deconstruction. Now, I have gone over on many videos deconstruction of art on my channel, but now we're reaching to this point where, guys, no one's saying anything new. No one is saying anything to enlighten the audience. We all know, for instance, Rings of Power is going to be bad. We don't need to give it a chance. We don't need to watch it. In fact, not only do we know it's going to be bad, we already know how it's going to be bad because we have 10 years at least of history where popular art is deconstructed. But that's not going to stop people from saying how it's bad, why it's bad, and people are going to consume and say, oh man, wasn't this so terrible? And why? It's not like they don't know. Again, it's not like they're not going to be enlightened with something new. It's because of that dopamine. They know what's going to be wrong with Rings of Power. They know what's going to be wrong with Disney in the future, but they want someone else, someone they like, to validate their opinions. This is the addiction of the bad. Now going back to media, it's parallel. People are addicted to seeing bad news. And people are addicted to seeing people that they like as commentators on bad news. Notice with all the shenanigans, political or otherwise, that's going out in the world, we all know there are very corrupt people out there. We all know that the world is not looking great. It's looking very, very bleak. But people who listen to the mainstream or even independent creators, people who listen to commentators that they respect, they have to be aware that they're only talking about the bad. They're not substituting the bad for something good, and they're not talking about solving the problem. They're only talking about their opposition. They're only talking about the rivals. They're only talking about the bad people on the other side. They're not creating a positive substitute. So, of course, one theme for my channel, for other channels like The Fourth Age or, Young Ripa, for instance, you know, instead of harping on the bad, we're also, using our energy to promote something good or producing something good, like with me and my electronic music and science fiction. Of course, I use that example time and time again. But the thing is, we're seeing independent creators actually produce something, actually solve a problem. With Eric July, for instance, people are tired of what's going on with DC and Marvel. So he actually presents a solution. There's another story to be had with his Rippaverse. We don't see this with mainstream media. We don't see this even with political commentators and even well-meaning independent commentators. Why? Because they do not have the power. They don't have the power to actually make a change. We're not seeing change for the good, kind of like with the Phantom Menace. The Phantom Menace actually, that's I'm going to contrast that because the Phantom Menace actually has a lot of power, but they just are not tapping into that power. And how do they have power? Well, they can say to their audience not to hate watch anything, and then no one would have views, and then Amazon's Rings of Power would be thrown into irrelevance, and that would be that. Now, with the commentators on like Fox News or CNN or whatever like that, or MSNBC, they have an audience, but they actually don't have the power to change something. And I think they know that. And instead, they just talk about the problems. They don't talk about solving the problems. They don't, and actually defending the Lotus Eaters, the British guys, they say, hey guys, this corrupt politician is in your district, is in your town. You need to write to this, member of the parliament or something like that. So they actually do push for actual political change in they push for their listeners living in England to actually do something, or Ireland or whatever the case is, but it's mainly England. But anyway, going back to the addiction of the bad, they're just talking about the problems. All these people, all these media outlets are just talking about the problems. They're talking about how bad the opposition is. They're talking about how bad the other side is, and they're talking about how bleak the problem is. But they don't substitute it with something else. They don't substitute it with something that is edifying. Now, the thing is, people could argue saying, "Hey, wait a second, Son of Graver, didn't you say you don't watch the news?" And it's like, I don't need to watch the news to understand that the news outlets and the independent creators understand the addiction of the bad. They get more views, they get more ratings when it comes to that. It's like, "Oh, yeah, this is a really bad story. What is the White House doing about this? Nothing." And so that's their discourse. And I was actually talking with my mom earlier this week on the phone where she was asking, where is this strife and division coming from? And I think it has to do, if you think about it deeply, it actually has to do with our need to solving problems. So let me just kind of extemporize just a little bit. Why do we create so much adversity, and why are we such a divisive group now, especially now. We've been divisive, well, of course, since the American Revolution in this country. But between the people who want to start the revolution and fight, and then the patriots, who are not the patriots. Um, what was the name? I can't remember. Those loyal to England. I think they were the loyalists. Yeah, I think that was their name. I can't remember. Anyway, so there's always been division. But actually, we live in a first world country with, yeah, we have problems, but we don't have problems like worn-torn countries have problems, or people with who undergo diseases like malaria, people who are absolutely impoverished, who do not have things like clean water or hygienic products or anything like that. While we have our own problems, we do not have adversity that would cause us to really contemplate how to survive, like many people in different countries, and whether it's war torn, or something of a dictatorship, or the remnants, or the aftermath of a dictatorship, uh, something with weather, something with crops, whatever the case is, something, countries that do not have the infrastructure that could support such technology as we have. So because of that, for our first world problems, yeah, we have problems, especially moral problems. We don't have physical problems as much as we have like moral dilemmas. So because our survival is not completely at risk here in the United States, we we're seeking adversity in other things. Why do we seek adversity at all? Why do we seek villains at all? Why do we seek, antagonists? Well, we are storytelling creatures. That's one thing. But also we are problem solvers by nature. I got that from Chris Gore. I think it's really intuitive that he said that. He said we have the propensity to solve problems. But now we're stuck in this real weird stasis where it's we're staying in the problems without resolving them, without solving them, and we're not wanting to leave our problems, if that makes sense. Because if there were people really trying to work out a problem, we would see it. We would see it in the news. We would find ways to reconcile. We would find ways to seek common ground among the political parties. We would try to find solutions. In fact, we would, if we really were working to solve problems, that would be the first thing on the news. It would be the bad news, then it would be immediately, okay, how do we solve this? But we don't. It's always about what the opposite side is doing wrong, because that's what's going to get the views and that's what's going to get the ratings. That's why we're so divided as a culture now. We don't want reconciliation, and we really, guys, I hate to say this, but as a society, we don't want to solve problems. We don't want the problems to go away because of that dopamine, that the addiction of the bad. So that's the second thing with all of these media outlets talking about different things in their online and then their in-person discourse. You got the emotion. They want you emotional. They want you in this kind of psychology of uncertainty and angst and anxiety. And then you've got as far as the psychology is concerned, you got the addiction of the bad, or addiction to the bad. I don't know which preposition to use, but I would have to consult with my prof on that. Okay, so a couple more, and then we'll get to the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. So emotion, that's what they're considering. The addiction to the bad, the addiction to stay in the problem claiming level, but not the problem solving level. Next is the unimportant. So I think this came to mind, at least for me. I grew much more aware of the political discourse with our current president. Now, I'm not here to say what I think of our current president, but I will talk about him in the way of comparing what the media is saying about him. So, there are many things that our current president has done that really should be that was at one point in the political discourse as eye-opening. There are very just grievous things, like just terrible, terrible things that have happened under our current administration that Americans really should um, that we should actually work hard to counter and salvage the good and uphold the good while really countering the bad. I guess I'll have to use a specific example, but one thing that I really wish we would not let go in our political discourse is the absolute moral and fiscal atrocities of Afghanistan. I don't need to go into the details. You guys might have your own opinions of the whole Afghanistan fiasco back last August. This is a year ago, and that really cut to my heart. The events going on over there. Not to mention just the fiscal corruption of it all. That a lot of our very expensive resources have gone to the hands of our enemies. So let's just say that. But out of everything going on with the current administration, I mean, there are a lot of things. Afghanistan really cut to my heart in particular, and the problem is, and I'm not even blaming the White House anymore for this. The problem is we're not talking about it. It's very interesting that the media doesn't talk about something on the level of Afghanistan because it is a moral and fiscal atrocity. If you think about it deep enough, it actually can. Well, if I think about it deep enough, it actually can depress me. Just on the scale of corruption that went on with that event, but the media doesn't talk about it. This very significant thing in our history. What do they talk about? They talk about our president being senile, or they make fun of our president eating ice cream or eating jello or whatever, or fighting with his jacket, as recently seen or whatever. I'm not saying you can't have levity, but this kind of joking about our president being senile is actually replacing the very bad things that are happening under this presidency. But no one's talking about it anymore. Why? Oh, well, it's a year old. It's like, I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, we shouldn't talk about the American Revolution anymore because that's centuries old. That happened such a long time ago. It's like, well, no, we should still talk about it. But now people are just now these jokes about our president being old and senile. That's actually, I'm not saying you can't have that in the discourse, and I don't believe in making fun of any president, whoever I'm for or whoever I'm not for, but I'm not saying you can't have that in the discourse, but it's in lieu of very, very serious things, very important things that I think the public should still be aware of, but we're not aware of Afghanistan anymore. We're not aware of the Americans stranded. We're not aware of very important things. Rather, we're aware of unimportant things. Now, people say, no, you can't say our president being senile is unimportant. I said, well, if you're only talking about that and not talk about the serious situations or the people working behind him, yeah, well, it's actually not as serious, and people should be intellectually honest about that. So media, whatever side of the political spectrum, but really actually I would say it's the conservative side when talking about Biden being senile. It's like, okay, guys, I get it. He's old. He eats ice cream, but why are we only talking about this? Okay. In fact, actually, I'm going to say this. This might be a little far-fetched, but we're paying so much attention to his shaking hands with an invisible person that I start to wonder, like, guys, I think this is on purpose. The reason why I say this is on purpose is because we're seeing it with Hollywood and popular culture, where there will be absolute political shenanigans with, something like the Kenobi series, and like, people, gaslighting, actresses gaslighting the public. And it's like, oh, I can't believe this is happening. And then, or even back a couple years ago, the firing of Gina Carano. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's actually happening. And then, and then it's like, oh, but I'm still going to watch the next show. I actually think the firing, like the what Lucasfilm or what Disney did with Gina Carano and how it produced such outrage, or Biden struggling with his jacket is producing such comedy. I actually think it's what's the word? What's the phrase? I'm thinking of a specific phrase where they are actually shining a shiny thing in one direction while trying to, like, cover up or hide another more serious thing. To me, because of how Hollywood has been working in popular culture, how people are using things like gaslighting and controversial things and publicity stunts and all of these things, in Hollywood, I'm wondering, I'm like, maybe Biden is doing this on purpose, this is just a theory. I'm not saying he's actually not, mentally unstable, but it's like, maybe they're hamming up his being senile to cover more egregious things. Now, that might be far-fetched, could be. I would admit if it was brought to light that that is far-fetched. I'm not one to shirk from changing my mind. But I think people, the news outlets and the White House would actually use the mental state of our president as levity or comedy to cover up more, egregious things. Just an aside, So anyway, that's what I want to cover there. We've got the emotion, we've got the addiction to the bad news, and then we've got the unimportant issues. I'm sorry, like Biden having ice cream. Just we got to talk about more serious stuff a little bit more frequently. Now, uh, let me grab a swig of water. We're almost at the chat. Um, so the last thing I want to say, and this is something I'm very careful myself. And by the way, you guys don't have to. I'm not encouraging you to do this or not do this. I'm just kind of telling you my experience. For me, when you are listening to your favorite podcasts or even the mainstream media, if you do listen to mainstream, I don't, but I'm not blaming anyone who does. Just be careful when you're listening to your favorite commentators. Um, Listen to their colloquial. Listen to the colloquial of the news outlets because colloquialism is it's very important to pick up on colloquialism. So, for instance, one of with my favorite commentators, they use the word "based" for saying something that is masculine, something that is heroic, something that is traditional, something that heroic, masculine, traditional. All those things are very important to me, but the word they use for to describe all that, like, oh, this politician was based when he said that, that means, he was traditional with the ideas. He's going against the mainstream opposition. They use the word base for that, or based rather in the past tense. And um and I used it a little bit for my Isildur stream, just for being cheeky, but I actually don't use that word in my discourse, whether it's online or with people in a room. I also don't use I know this is kind of surprising. I don't use the word woke. I don't use the word I don't use the I've never, unless I'm talking about not using the word, I never have used SJW. I've never used those words of colloquialism for a couple specific reasons. The first reason is if I use the word based all the time, or if I use the word woke all the time, well, that would actually pin me to my time. It's an expression of our times. So people 20 years from now or 30 years from now, they'll go back, like we would go back to the 1960s, like, oh, that's keen, man. That's keen. We would know that's the way people of the late 50s and 60s said, oh, wow, that's cool, or something like that. When people will go back to our time 30 years from now and say, oh, that was so based, it would be outdated. It's a very outdated term. The term woke will be outdated. And so I try to use language that actually will proceed into another generation, that will actually be used 100 years from now or 200 years from now, because I don't want my way of arguing, being argumentative in any way, dressing. What am I trying to say? I don't want the way I speak to be dated, because if it is dated, then I'm only pinned to this sentiment of our times, the sentiment of 2020. I don't want to use language that is only specific for this decade. Now, I'm not against people saying, using colloquialism. I listen to many people, many of my friends use the colloquial. My prof uses the colloquial, those terms like woke or whatever. And I'm not against it, but it doesn't present my argument any stronger. And this leads to my second reason for not using colloquialism. If I used words like based or woke, then I've already been pinned to one side. Now I do have a side. I'm Christian. I'm conservative. I've probably got some libertarian views too. um, but but using that very specific vocabulary, that actually people who on the other side, or maybe central of the side, uh, if they heard those words, they would immediately shut me off. That's how divisive we are in our current state of things. And so if I soften my language by using language that people will use 30 years from now, that actually had there's a little, I would say that you have then the propensity to be more unified, or at least be more reconciled. I don't I don't like using words like woke for that reason. And I especially do not like the word anti as a prefix to everything. Like, for instance, I feel bad. I kind of feel bad for young Ripa in a way. He's just wanting to tell a good story, and people have, whether they're for him or against him, they have said his story is anti woke. Now, they have softened it. I have heard it softened to non-woke, but I already hate that term anyway. It's like, it's just a story. It's just a good story. It's not anti this. That's the thing. We're now so um predisposed to being anti of something, not for something. I am not anti, I'm just not for something. It's like, "Oh, you're not for this, you must be anti this." I'm like, "No, never. I was never anti." So, that's the colloquial. When you listen to these major media outlets, both independent and mainstream, that they'll use the colloquial. They'll use, if they're conservatives, they'll use things like based. Obviously, people in our community will use words like woke. Again, I'm not against people using that language. I just really am careful not to use it myself, because I feel like people can more easily undermine your argument if you use that kind of rhetoric. So that's what I wanted to talk about. We'll get to the chat real quick, and then we'll wrap it up at the hour. I thought this was going to be 35 minutes, but it's always longer, but that's okay. So just as a recap, careful when listening to your favorite commentators, because all media, no matter the rivals, no matter the people you side with, they use these four traits. They use emotion, so anything that will induce a hyper emotive state in your psyche or your psychology or your heart. They utilize uh, to a high degree of the addiction of the bad news. They know you're addicted to wanting to know bad news, the addiction of the bad. Thirdly, or the third thing, the unimportant. I mean, guys, come on. Like, fine, laugh at Biden, whatever, but just don't laugh at him in lieu of saying the very serious things that our White House has done. And then lastly, the colloquial. When you're using your language, use language that all sides of the spectrum or all parts of the spectrum can use. And not only that, if anyone should dig up this video in the future, or any of my videos, they'll hear language that they use in the future. Because I will say, my prediction is the word woke will not be a term in 10 years. I hope it's sooner than that, but oh well. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the chat, and then we'll wrap it up at the hour. Good to see you guys. Hopefully a lot of that made sense because I was, extemporizing and doing this on the fly. Welcome, Jared. They're the media. They all stink. Yeah. Let's see. Brian's got some good points. Let's go ahead and pull those up. You're right about the anxiety of the news induces. In my case, it didn't help that I was the only nerd I knew that had my particular political leanings. Yeah. I stopped watching the news around the time of 2016. Yeah, that would probably have been a good time to stop. Part of it was the election, right? And then the other part was the Gamergate and how the media handled it. Yeah. Exactly. It's very suspect, wasn't it? You also say the news can be depressing. The vast majority of it is highly negative and very few positive. Yeah, I mean, there's one time, I will say this. There was one time when Fanman was doing his live streams, twice a week. He would start, I think he would do the first 10 to 15 minutes just on good news and heartwarming news. And the thing is, it's such a sad state of affairs, but and I also would be among those people. Admittedly, I would be among those people that would be less interested in the good news and more interested in the bad news. That's just how we've been conditioned. And then you also say at some point, people need to realize that hate watching has accomplished nothing. Not only has it accomplished nothing, it's accomplished a lot of bad stuff too. If that was all it took to change the entertainment, it would have happened already. And I agree. Again, I have nothing against being objective when it comes to bad art, but now it's regurgitation. And at the very least, these people should stop watching it. I've even heard, guys, just a quick aside, not making this up. I even heard, with the cancellation of that Batgirl film, first of all, that should be good news for most people. But as far as where DC had been headed, I kid you not, I heard people that I like, people that I respect, say, "Oh man, I kind of want to see it now. If it was that bad." I was like, "No, be happy. It's never seen the light of day. Why would you want that imprinted upon your memory?" It's like, no. In fact, actually, some people, I think I remember reading in the comments in different videos, like, "Oh man, Michael Keaton, and we don't get to see him." I'm like, you probably should be grateful that he's not totally humiliated in that film. Like, you will never see the humiliation of Michael Keaton because of this film being canceled. So I think people, rather than be sad that it's not released so they can watch it or hate watch it, be happy that it will never see the light of day. If I had the power to have Rings of Power never see the light of day, I would act on that in an instant, but I don't have that power. But even if for some chance, for some weird, serendipitous chance that Rings of Power never saw the light of day, people now would say, "Oh, I wish I could see just how bad it was." I was like, "No, just have it not exist." All right. Private Eye, welcome. Things like this make me love. Things like this is what makes me love my family. You mean they don't watch the news, or they do watch the news? I never grew up in a household that was watching the news all the time. I know some households, they just have the news on all the time, and I know that's not good for your psychology. I moved towards retro gaming and tokusatsu to those shows precisely because I wanted something positive in my life, not just to be steeped in negativity. I already know how bad things are today. Speaking of retro gaming, I finished Final Fantasy VI a couple weeks ago, and I started Chrono Trigger for the first time. I love it. I don't really know the story of Chrono Trigger like I know the stories of Final Fantasy, and it's been a joy, and I love the music. And the prof actually has liked Chrono Trigger. Watching me play, he's liked the story and the characters a lot more than the Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is good, but it really is more gameplay than story. Um, but I love Final Fantasy, but there is something really, really special about Chrono Trigger. Craig is in the house. Welcome, Wagner. Cynical as it sounds, I think it's less that people are addicted to the bad and more that people are bad, and the bad is often their outlet. People love to complain and fight and tear things down. I think that's very insightful of you to say that, um, because I think it exposes a dark side in all of us. Like we we want to see the tearing. Yeah, you're right. We if we're addicted to the bad news and the bashing of things, then that's kind of saying we've been exposed to showing people that we're not afraid of tearing things down. Like we would have this uh kind of sounds sadistic, but this pleasure of tearing things down, and that's not good. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's really insightful. You're right there. Final Fantasy, welcome. To paraphrase Karth Anasi from Kodor, guess ignorance never goes out of fashion. I I, I don't mind some ignorance, to be honest, but Prof approves. And then Brian says a lot of today's problems could be solved more readily if people weren't so addicted to the dopamine hit of adversity. Yeah, and I was telling my mom this too. I've done this huge overhaul in my first book of my science fiction, and I'm extremely happy with it. I feel so good about this decision, and it has a lot of stakes and it has a lot of adversity right up front, but it will have even more adversity as the story goes on, as the characters are put in this situation. And I love it. I love telling stories of stakes and adversity. And I just wish people who would just be attracted to adversity just to get off the social media and just write something like a stream of consciousness, just journal out like characters duking it out or something. I actually think that would be a wonderfully cathartic thing for our society. But the thing is, I don't have any need for adversity. One, I'm a Christian, so I think there's going to be adversity in my life anyway. Christians seem to be put in those situations by default. But even so, even if that wasn't the case, even if I was a Christian living a relatively comfortable life, I have books and stories to write, and it takes away, removes anything. Like, I would never want that kind of drama in my life because I can put it in a creative way. All right. Herman, welcome. You're ignoring, oh yeah, ignoring positive aspects of something you dislike is never smart. It's way more useful to have nuance. For example, the choreography of Anakin versus Obi-Wan is good, but story-wise, it's lame. Choreography. Oh, I mean, I feel like it could have been done better if you're talking about the Revenge of the Sith. That's one of my one of the complaints that my dad has of Revenge of the Sith. He thought that Anakin fell too quickly. I do love the prequels, but I do think the fall of Anakin could have been fleshed out a lot better. All right, a few more, and then we will go. I meant to have this like 45 minutes, but now it's an hour. I think making fun of Biden for those things says more about the people making those comments than Biden. It's always easy to tell when someone's criticizing with good faith versus bad faith. Yeah, I think, again, I'm not against satire. I'm not against levity. I'm not against good humor. But I strongly caution against that in place of something more serious. You can have the satire and the serious. Actually, I do want to make a note. Like, actually, Prof, I didn't even tell you this, but I've been over the last couple of years. I've been watching this comedian, and he's great. He's really talented. This comedian called JP Sears, and his channel is called Awaken with JP, and he does satire. He does political satire. And over the last few years, it's been really, really funny. But the last month or two, I tell you, man, it's been dark. Like, he's actually added dark comedy. Now, I'm not against dark comedy. I think it has its place, but I'm not really for it myself as a viewer. And I would be laughing at things, and then it would have a really dark ending. And you're supposed to feel disturbed by it, but he's actually now taken that tone to where I'm like, you know what? I think he's a really talented guy, and I really wish him the best for his comedy. But it's gotten to the point where now he in his satire is it's just too much of a warning label. It's like everyone and their grandmother want to warn you about things, and it's like, "Enough. I've got my warning. I've got the warning. I need to watch Thundercats, okay?" Alright. And then, Private Eye says, "Thing is, I'm 28 and I've never heard a president in my country that could be called good." Oh, wow. All of them were terrible in so many ways, including the priest. Yeah, I mean, I you don't have to say what country you're from, but, that's yeah, I remember actually subletting, an apartment with a Chinese girl, and, she was I don't think she was an exchange student. She had this, work program with her college, and she told me, this was when, Trump was president, and okay, so she's from China, right? So she sees the political, complications there, and her Chinese was broken, so she was really shy. She was always shy around me because she thought she couldn't speak English very well, but she spoke very, very well, all things considered. And she asked me one time, we were cooking and making dinner, and she said, "Why can I ask you, what do you think of Trump?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really for him or against him at the time, and I'm pretty neutral about him as a person. I'm not so salivating over him, and I'm not so diehard against him." Now she was asking me this because she she was in college at the time, in her exchange program, and she's like, "Everywhere in college, all these students are just complaining, complaining, complaining about Trump, and I don't get why they have to complain about Trump." What would that because she could not understand people in a free country complaining about a president they disagree with in a free country, because she came from, she comes from China. And, I thought that was very fascinating, but anyway, yeah. It's awesome. Maybe we're going through all the old 1985 Thundercats, but that's good. Alright, so, thank you guys so much for watching and listening, and, just as just an announcement, what was my announcement? Oh, yes, this was the 100th live stream. So, in celebration of that, tomorrow night, I'll just be talking about just the different things about live streaming and what I've learned, and maybe just talk about random popular stuff, popular culture stuff, popular news. I don't know, but it'll be a very casual live stream. Like, if you guys had ever thought about live streaming yourself, there are things that attract views and there are things that do not attract views. And I have come to learn uh, what is popular and what is not so popular. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and listening to the Sunday stream. Of course, I meant it to be short, but it's over an hour, so I'll go ahead and log off. But until I see you tomorrow, Monday, keep producing and preserving the good art you love, and just be vigilant with whomever you are watching and listening to. Take care.